If you watched my last video, and thank you if you did, but if you didn't watch it, that's okay, because I'll cover some of the stuff from that video in this video. This one is going to be on the Panopticon. I'm a little bit obsessed with the idea of the Panopticon, I won't lie. I just think it's fascinating, you know, and I think what Foucault said, what the original creator of the Panopticon said, what others have said, they're all in this video. They've got great things to say about academia. It's been there for a while, the surveillance society model. You could use the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11 as a good starting point, but it did start a little bit before that. We were always interested in not trusting our subjects in education. Subjects being, you know, children, students, older students, whatever, the whole spectrum. We do have a problem with trusting people, and it is easy to assume that, you know what, one of you is cheating, so we're just going to tear you all with the same brush, and it's up to you to prove that you're not cheating through, you know, and the list is endless, you know, like reading comprehension, critical thinking, all that sort of stuff. And the more we design these systems to catch people out or to not trust them, the more ironically untrustworthy the subjects of the system become. And I think obviously in the wake of AI, people plagiarizing, people just getting a computer just to write their whole thesis or assignment for them, that panoptic system or that panoptic lens is only going to become more and more magnified. And the more scrutinized a student will be, the more paranoid they're going to be, and the more they're just going to go, do you know what, I'm not going into the prison educational complex anymore, you know. There's a little bit of doom and gloom, a little bit of paranoia on my part in here. I'm probably worrying too much, but it's good to worry too much about something and then try and figure out a way out of it. You know, it's strategizing. It's essentially, you're inventing a problem that doesn't exist just yet, or exists in a smaller version of it. And you're catastrophizing the situation to try and come up with a solution to it. There's no solution to the Panopticon of education in this video. There's a few different ways that Panopticon is happening, and there's a few studies that I have drawn from. But I offer no solution to the Panopticon because the solution is unsustainable. It would require the academic system to just change completely and to trust everyone. Again, just to use the Panoptic, because it comes from the prison system. It would be like saying, we're not going to have prisons anymore. We're just going to let everyone wander around and we're going to trust them that they don't murder or whatever anyone ever again. And it's the same system that academia is at the moment. It's like, we know ChatGPT, Illicit, and all those other programs are here. We're going to trust you not to use them. And we're going to have some systems in place which may or may not work to try and catch you out. But ultimately, it's an honor-based system. We rely on you to say, no, I didn't use ChatGPT to write my essay or to write this part of my thesis or whatever. And we have to trust you. And we have ways of catching people out, but ultimately, you have to admit it. So I think all those conversations, questions are very good. As I said, look, it's just a little, most of these videos are philosophical musings that I've had in conversations with lecturers, in my own job, or any students I've come in contact with. And I think this video does provide a good discussion point for those questions I have, and for questions you may have as well. So yeah, enjoy the video. Now, Foucault's notion of the Panopticon, that describes a system in which power operates not through direct force, but through constant observation, or at least the possibility of observation. And in educational settings, this can manifest in a few different ways. I suppose one of the more nefarious things is CCTV cameras in schools monitoring student movements and activities. But in terms of systems and software, we do have AI-driven proctoring software, which watches students during online exams. And of course the LMS systems, the learning management systems, that can track logins, time spent on pages, and assignment submissions. Attendance and engagement monitoring tools are also used. These can use biometric data, facial recognition, very taboo topics, of course, when it comes to children. And of course, right up to the very top with college, we do have automated plagiarism detection tools that compare student work to a global database. Now, how it does that is quite precarious. As I noted in my other videos, we're not quite there yet with AI detection. And all of these tools and technologies help create a digital panopticon where students internalize the expectation of being watched. and they therefore modify their behavior accordingly. And in theory, they study longer and avoid certain behaviors, or they self-censor, not necessarily because of intrinsic motivation, but because of the perceived omnipresence of surveillance. Now, how does the Panopticon shape student behavior? Well, in these types of educational system, the students theoretically learn to self-regulate, and this regulation can lead to both positive and negative outcomes. Now, in terms of the positive effects, we do have increased academic integrity, improved attendance and participation, early identification of struggling students, again in theory, and in theory, again, safer school environments. Now, the word safer there is in multiple inverted commas, depending on how you view safety and in terms of how you view your children's rights. Now, the negative effects have also been noted by many different types of studies. We have anxiety and stress over constant monitoring. Obviously, we have a loss of trust then between the students and the teachers, feelings of depersonalization, a loss of autonomy, suppression of creativity is another one, experimentation due to fear of surveillance, all feeding into that idea of the Panopticon. Are we being watched? Who is watching us? Is there anyone there? That type of stuff. And it does bring into the idea of surveillance overreach and, of course, autonomy overreach. Now, I'm struggling to remember my Latin from my studies, but I suppose the English will suffice here from the ancient Roman poet. Who guards the guards themselves, or who watches the watchmen, I suppose is the more famous of the term. And that obviously relates to regulation, control by people above us. And it does feed into this sort of post 9/11 mass surveillance type society we live in. Who watches the watchers? Once you buy into the system of, well, we get to monitor the students, you yourself then are also monitored. And it does feed into that sort of Foucaultian theory that surveillance is never neutral, disciplines as much as it controls, I guess. And the rise of AI in education is only going to intensify that panoptic dynamic. And you have tools like ProctorU, Examity. They use AI to monitor eye movement, background noise, facial expressions during online exams. As if it wasn't stressful enough, Obviously, Turnitin, very famous, great scope. That uses machine learning to detect plagiarism or assess writing patterns. And then you have LMS platforms like Moodle or Blackboard that collects extensive user data to analyze engagement and performance. Even educational chatbots and virtual assistants, while they do provide support and collect user data, they do also create a detailed behavioral profile for each student. And these technologies create a learning ecosystem where data is continuously harvested, analyzed, and then used not only for personalization, but also for surveillance and control, as I mentioned earlier. And this idea of the Panopticon in education, it does raise critical ethical concerns. Who controls the data collected from students, and how securely is it stored? In terms of consent, are students fully aware of the extent and purpose of this data collection? And that raises issues of equity. Does surveillance technology disproportionately target or disadvantage a certain group of students or certain groups of students, such as maybe marginalized communities or communities that may be under surveillance already? I suppose in terms of Ireland, we may look at traveller education as like a marginalised group who are already under intense scrutiny. And of course, the big one out of all of that is obviously autonomy. To what extent does constant monitoring limit student creativity and exploration and risk-taking? One of the great suppressors in the prison system is risk-taking, obviously. And what does all that have to do with learning? Ultimately, do we just become, instead of becoming educators, we become detectives, trying to figure out, is this generated by AI? And then we graduate from being detectives then just becoming prison guards. We're just watching. Or the perception in terms of the Panopticon is someone else is watching for us, or the perceived idea of watching. And being watched is never nice. There is a psychological impact of being watched. And all of it, and there's multiple studies out there, outside of education even, and this type of control and surveillance does lead to increased anxiety and stress. Obviously, there's a reduction in intrinsic motivation. And then you're kind of left then with just surface level learning. You're just doing enough to avoid the penalties. You're not really wanting to stretch your legs. You're not going to go the extra distance because, is it allowed? Am I allowed to do that? So you're constantly just sort of staying in your safe area. And one of the big problems we have in the educational system is that we don't want to create offenders or people who just leave college thinking, what a waste of time. And they just have a reduced trust then, not only in educational institutions, but any type of government institution or public-facing institution. And therefore, the whole curiosity and creativity with AI, it sort of dies then because it just becomes this exercise in, it's almost like a parental thing, where it's like the easiest way to make something unpopular is to have your parents excited by it. So I do think educational institutions do need to rethink how surveillance technologies are integrated into learning spaces, or indeed, should they be integrated? And there's obviously, some of the studies here have mentioned a few possible alternatives to mitigate the panoptic effect. And they include transparent data policies, opt-in features, anonymous analytics, and obviously designing AI tools that empower rather than control. And you'd have a bigger focus then on feedback, support, and growth instead of punishment. It's good to see that there is a move towards that now. Colleges are no longer saying it's taboo or it's illegal or we're banning it. And all of that comes from incorporating student voices into decisions about this educational technology. It's always healthy, I believe, to challenge the traditional top-down power dynamics reinforced by such panoptic structures. Now, the university has long been a site of both freedom and discipline. It's a space where knowledge is created, but it's also a place where norms, rules, and hierarchies operate invisibly. With the rise of AI in education, especially within the process of students writing their essays and theses and projects using it, and it's not simply about plagiarism detection anymore, and this surveillance increasingly monitors now how students write, when they write, how fast they write, with what tools they use, and even how creatively they use it. And I suppose the purpose of this video is to figure out, is that relevant? Is that something we want? Or is it the only method by which we do it? We can't ban AI. So how do we control it and how do we monitor it? And the only really thing you can do, other than just have a 24/7 police force, inverted commas, involved in it, is the panoptic structure. But it's not quite Bentham's prison tower or even Foucault's disciplinary society. This is a data-driven, algorithmic panopticon, where the watcher is not human anymore, it's a machine, and the gaze is therefore constant and seemingly predictive. The early 2000s did see plagiarism detection software like Turnitin or SafeAssign gain traction in universities, and these systems were relatively blunt tools. They could detect similarity between texts, but they could not see how a text was produced. But now the new generation of AI tools shifts the focus from product to process. And then suddenly you're faced with this new scenario where students are required to compose their essays inside university-provided AI writing platforms. And it's a system that logs their keystrokes, their pauses, deletions, revisions, and even eye movement if possible. And I suppose the purpose of that would be to see if they're looking off screen at something and what exactly they're looking at. And it would record the history of every paragraph. Was it typed, copy-pasted, generated, inserted suddenly without prior activity? What is the context of the writing exercise? And this whole construct then would just basically create a writing profile for each student over time. And then plagiarism detection would just become obsolete. Why look for stolen work when you can simply watch the writing happen in real time? And so it just becomes a panopticon not only of the final product, but of the whole act itself. And therefore, society just becomes the panopticon then. You don't even have to be in prison. You don't even have to commit a crime. The crime is presumed anyway. You just have to serve your sentence now. And in this scenario, the student knows, or at least suspects, that the entire writing process is visible. And this could result in several behavioral effects characteristic of such a panopticon, such as self-censorship of thought. They might avoid taking intellectual risks. They may not experiment with controversial arguments anymore. And then they may rush through stuff. They may not pause anymore to think about something because that could be viewed as suspicious. And unfortunately, that would just lead to a sort of a hyper-conformity where writing becomes more formulaic. And AI scoring systems, if they do exist in this world, that might reward certain patterns. And it just pushes students to write like machines. Ironically then, students end up producing material that is static and staccato in the same manner that ChatGPT would. And ironically, students who write best off-platform, for example, brainstorming on paper, formulating ideas in their head, those type of students could then be punished for non-linear writing behavior. And I suppose that's the power of the Panopticon, is that not only does it watch, but it makes you watch yourself. And this all leads to profound questions. Is originality then measured by ideas or by typing patterns? What happens if a student's thesis writing style changes drastically because they improved, or because they collaborated with peers, or even matured as a thinker? Could deviation from your past writing signature be flagged as suspicious then? It's no longer have you cheated, but rather are you writing like yourself? It just becomes this George Orwell 1984 type situation, where your peers or your betters, in inverted commas, are monitoring your wrong think. And in this AI panoptic scenario, disputes about authorship may no longer involve human academics directly. We have to then consider possible processes. A student is then accused by the system of non-authentic writing behavior, and AI would then produce a detailed report, word frequencies, sentence complexity, pause durations, interkey timings, and then human markers may just defer to the AI's probabilistic certainty, where an AI just says, well, it looks like 85% of this thesis was written unorganically. And then, you can appeal that obviously as a student, but against what? A model trained on their own past behavior. And it's sad to say, and I'm a great man for the literary world, and I'm always finding sort of metaphors or parallels in the literary world. All of this is very Kafkaesque to me, where the evidence against the student is their own previous self. It's a very sobering thought. But the Panopticon of writing would not stop at just merely plagiarism detection. Universities driven by metrics and performance indicators, they might start just using AI to monitor productivity itself. So you just have real-time dashboards for supervisors showing whether PhD students are writing regularly. AI alerts triggered if no writing activity is detected over a certain period. Well, you might have slept in an extra hour. Well, that's going to be counted against you now. Where were you for that 1 hour? Can you prove you were asleep? And obviously the big one, there's an analysis then of procrastination patterns based on app switching or browser activity. Your 10-minute holiday on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. And were you actually on holiday? Were you actually looking at silly videos, or were you looking up videos on how to cheat the AI system? Big Brother is always watching. Writing, once this, personal, messy and uneven process, we've all been there. We've all done the stream of consciousness, the James Joycean road to nowhere. But that's now done away with, and it's punishable. And I think these AI-based writing assistants like Grammarly, ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, that's only going to further blur the line then between help and control. What happens when the same tools that aid you are also recording your process? Do they then talk to university behind your back about you? The student is never told directly to write by these programs, but the path of least resistance becomes conformity then. And that's the soft power of the Panopticon. It's shaping without commanding. And then, we get into the horrible world of monetization. Could corporations or universities monetize student writing behaviors as predictive analytics for other sectors? But as in all surveillance environments, practices of resistance are always likely to emerge. And I've thought about this a lot, of how to, how do we break the system? And I think if you write a first draft offline and then you manually type it into monitor platforms, it's one way around it. Using AI tools privately to draft, but then writing quote unquote organically for the platform. And then you can just be one of those type of students who decides to play with the system, pausing for long periods of time for no other reason than just as a FU to the system. Irregular typing, stylistic shifts, shifty eyes for no reason other than to say, well, I'm watching you too. And we could even see the rise of anti-surveillance thesis writing workshops. Like an underground resistance, I suppose, teaching students how to write without leaving algorithmically readable traces. So, in concluding this video, we have to look at some key ethical questions here. What is the appropriate balance between academic integrity and surveillance. Should students have the right to opt out of AI-monitored writing environments? Who owns the processed data on us? The student or the institution? And what transparency obligations exist around AI surveillance tools? The Panopticon of AI in student writing, it's not a distant dystopia. It is rapidly becoming technically feasible, and in some pilot programs, it does already exist. I'm going to do something here which is a bit strange. I'm going to compare it to the Patriot Act in America, where the events of 9/11 fast-forwarded a lot of legislation and rules and regulations about mass surveillance, mass policing. And I think this issue of AI in education is forcing a lot of universities to panic. And in that panic, they may create this type of panopticon here I'm talking about. I always refer to it as the coronavirus of education. Seemingly come out of nowhere, caused massive changes within the sector, and we're still playing catch up. Unfortunately, I think in playing that catch up, we can panic. The real question then becomes not a technological one, but a philosophical one. Do we want the act of academic writing, creativity, do we want that to be a form of digital labor, monitored and optimized? Or do we want it to remain as what it always has been at its best, a messy, vulnerable, exploratory act of thought? The architecture of AI surveillance offers educational institutions a choice. Do we cultivate trust and creativity, or do we just end up building this academic panopticon, where all a student learns is to watch themselves?